Now from Capitol Hill's Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. He was Bush the father's legislative affairs director and then went on to serve as the United States Trade Representative under his son, President George W. Bush. He comes today from Capitol Hill. Thank you so much, Senator, for joining us.
David, thanks for having me on.
You were a trade representative yourself. You know trade well. You also were in 41's White House. So did the times change, or are there just two fundamentally different views of trade here between these two presidents?
Well, I think two things. One, 24 years is a long time, and it was time to revamp the North American Free Trade Agreement. We needed to modernize it, among other things. It didn't include e-commerce. The labor and environmental standards were not nearly what we have in our more modern trade agreement. So it was time. But second, yeah, there's a difference of opinion between the two in terms of the impact of trade on our country and specifically, what we do with regard to tariffs.
So what, in your assessment, is the overall effect of globalization or trade? I mean, since World War II, we've been working on reducing trade, tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers. Has it overall been good for the American economy? Has it been good for the American worker?
Well, it's hard to argue that it hasn't been, because America has become not just the world's strongest economy, but you see the kind of economic growth we've had that's the envy of the world. But having said that, David, as you know, I've talked about this a lot, we need to have balanced trade. In other words, we need to be sure that our exports have a fighting chance, leveling the playing field, reciprocity, all those are really important. So we need to be sure that there is trade, but that the trade is one that benefits both sides. Second, we need to be sure that with regard to imports into our country, that they're fairly traded, so that they're not dumped so below their cost or subsidized. And as you know, we've won some big cases against China recently with regard to that issue. So yes, trade is really important, but we've got to be sure that all countries in the world are playing by the same rules.
So to bring it to the very specifics, I mean, at your meeting, as I understand it today, perhaps, with Mary Barra, the head of General Motors, who announced they're going to be laying off a lot of people, shutting a lot of plants, including in Ohio. Is there a direct line between trade on the one hand, whether it's NAFTA with China or with Europe for that matter, a direct line between that and the decisions that Mary Barra and GM are making right now?
Well, she's making decisions, as you know, to deal with her overcapacity. I think she said publicly that they have about 25% overcapacity in their system. She's also got a car that's being made in Ohio that she says is not selling. What we are saying to her, and what I've said to her on many occasions over the last several months, not just recently, is that we want a new product in Ohio. And if General Motors is indeed going to make 20 new electric car models in the next 5 years, we want one built in Lordstown. And it makes sense, because this is a plant that has done very well by General Motors. It just won a J.D. Power award this year. It's been competitive. It's one where the UAW has made concessions. So the workers have stood by GM. It's time for GM to stand by them and make a commitment to the plant. In terms of the trade issues, we also have to talk about the tax issues, because, as you know, the tax reform effort that was just completed makes it much more competitive to stay in the United States. As an example, people are talking about the difference between Mexico and the United States. Well, Mexico's corporate rate is 30%. Ours went from 35, which was higher, down to 21, which is a lot lower. But we also have immediate expensing, so an investment in the Lordstown plant can be written off immediately, which is a huge advantage. So my hope is the tax policy, in addition to trade policy, in addition to regulatory policy, makes it advantageous for GM to make this further commitment to Ohio and to our country.
So, Senator, you not only served as trade representative, you also served as the director of Office of Management and Budget. You had to worry about things like deficits and debt and things like that, something you're a student of. As we think about George Herbert Walker Bush, he had to make some tough decisions in that 1990 budget deal. May have cost him the presidency, actually. We talked with George Mitchell, who was majority leader at the time. This is what he said about those decisions.
That resulted in a budget package that had pain for everyone. There were some tax increases, some spending cuts, but it laid the foundation, followed 3 years later by President Clinton's budget, which produced balanced budgets in this country, something that hasn't occurred very often in the past half-century.
Now, of course, President Bush had pledged he would not raise new taxes, and then he changed that view. But we have a chart that actually shows that as a result of that, in fact, revenues went up, debt went down, and it may well have situated the United States under the Clinton presidency for really growth and a balanced budget ultimately. Do we need to be making those kinds of decisions today?
Well, first, let me just say that when George Bush made that decision, it did show his courage, political courage. He wanted to do what was right for the country. And you recall that the agreement was $3 in cuts for every $1 in tax increases. The reality is those $3 in cuts to spending did not occur, at least in a timely way. So it was an agreement that he agreed to with certain conditions, and Congress is not very good at following through on the cuts in spending, as you know, and that was an example. But having said that, I think you're right. I think it did set up the possibility for the kind of economic growth we saw in the late 1990s. That was the primary reason that we got to a balanced budget. Nobody expected the economy to grow as much as it did. You recall also in the 1990s, we cut capital gains taxes, and $100 billion showed up in the federal coffers that no one expected, and that $100 billion helped us to get to the point where we had a unified balanced budget. So it was a combination of things, David. Today the problem is different, both in terms of scope. President Bush was very worried about a $250 billion deficit. We would be happy to be in that situation today rather than the one we're in. And this is not something new. It's something that has been coming over the past decade and been happening. So we have even bigger challenges today. And yes, we do need to put together a package to ensure that we can get this fiscal situation under control so that it doesn't have a terribly detrimental impact on the economy, which is possible if we don't deal with it. I will also say that over that period of time, what's in the discretionary spending with Congress versus what's in the mandatory spending, interest on the debt, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, important safety net programs, but those mandatory spending programs have grown tremendously, so that's a bigger and bigger part of the budget and the fastest growing part of the budget.
Which in many ways makes it a much more difficult problem to tackle, actually, than when it's all discretionary as a practical matter. But you now are a lawmaker. You were a very senior staff person back then. Now you're a lawmaker. Do you see a realistic path forward to try to accomplish some of the things that need to be accomplished? Or are we just being nostalgic when we talk about what happened back in the late 80s into the early 90s?
No, look, I do, and as you know, I think the tax reform is responsible in part for this incredible economic growth we've seen over the past several months. And you were having discussions earlier about Europe, and that 1.2, 1.3 point economic growth seems like it's okay for Europe. Well, that was the new normal here too for a while, 1.5 to 2% really, and now we're looking at over 3% growth this year, and we're seeing not just that, but actually more revenues have come into the federal coffers this year from our income taxes than they did last year at this time. So not a lot, but there's more taxes coming in, there's more revenue coming in because of the economic growth. So that's part of the solution here, as we saw in the late 1990s. How do you get this economy not just to be at 3 or 3.5 or 4% as it's been this year for a short period of time, but for a sustained period of time? And then how do you deal with the spending, which is unsustainable in its current form? And I think that combination is still something that Congress and the administration should be dealing with.
Okay, Senator, thank you so very much for your time today on this very important day of national mourning and that funeral service for your old boss, President George Herbert Walker Bush. That's Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio coming to us from the Capitol.
Thanks, David.